welcome to Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative view of today's news, politics, culture, and events. And today's topic, unions. What do you think of labor unions? Are they necessary today? Hopefully, after you listen into today's episode and listen to today's guests, you'll be able to give an informed opinion on whether you think labor unions are still necessary in today's political, cultural, economic climates. Before I get into that, though, heads up, Washington Times offering 50% discount for a year's access to the digital edition of the Washington Times. That's news, commentaries, and podcasts like this one. 50% off. Go to washingtontimes.com/Cheryl and just type in a little information. Shouldn't take more than a few seconds. And there you have it. A year's access to the digital edition of the Washington Times. Look, the deal won't last forever, and you really need to have some information out there to help you fight the far leftists in the media. So Washington Times is a great news product. We have reporters here that do some really investigative type work, different from anywhere else. And of course, the commentary page, it's unrivaled. You can't beat it. And while you're at it, while you're signing up, washingtontimes.com/Cheryl for your year's worth of digital access to the Washington Times, go to washingtontimes.com and sign up to my 3 times a week newsletter. In it, you will get all my commentaries that I write all week long, all of them, right into your email box, along with my twice-weekly podcast, my twice-weekly Bold and Blunt podcast. Just find my name on the website, click on it, click on my hyperlink to name, and it'll take you to the directions on how to sign up for my 3 times a week newsletter as well as my podcast. I would love to have you as a regular listener and as a regular subscriber to my commentaries. And feel free to drop a line at my email box and tell me how I'm doing. I especially like story tips. So feel free after you sign up, send me an email, tell me, hey, I just joined onto your newsletter list and I've got a story idea for you. Chances are I'll at least say thank you. So, labor wars in the United States. How up are you on your history of the labor movement in the United States? Just as a quick refresher, it was after the Civil War that America started going through this industrialized period, right, where factories started popping up and railroads in particular started being built across the United States. And as this revolution was being waged, workers oftentimes found themselves in positions where they thought they were being exploited. They thought that they were being worked too hard and paid too little. And in many cases, they were right? A lot of these capitalists, a lot of these builders took advantage of the workers, and they drove them little more than slaves. And just as a quick aside, this is not a call for a crackdown on free market capitalism. What it is just an underscore of how very important it is that citizens in this country look to God. And because without the moral compass from above, it's not just government that goes astray. It's not just government that becomes overburdensome and overreaching and clamping on individuals. It's also the private sector, right? I mean, that works for both the public and private sectors, that in this country we need men and women of proper moral compass to first keep government limited and second, keep the private sector walking a principled path so we don't give socialists like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez an excuse to point at these evil capitalists, or Barack Obama cause and justification to talk about the fat cat Wall Street types, and then denounce the private sector and use a private sector that has become exploitative of its workers as cause to call for government crackdowns as reason to rally around the need for bigger government to control the private sector. So that's just a quick aside. What it all comes down to is that individuals, whether they're in government or private sector, need to keep God as the priority, need to follow godly principles, biblical principles, in order to stay on the straight and narrow and so they don't exploit people. But back to the industrial period in America. So some of these workers were starting to get ticked off, and they started banding together and rebelling against their bosses. Remember the mine wars in 1874? Mine operators in Pennsylvania, 10,000 of them went on a strike because of their poor living conditions based on their utterly ridiculously low wages. And then there was the Great Railroad Strike that was in West Virginia, right? That was over reductions in wages for the railroad workers. That one grew violent. A bunch of workers were killed in Maryland. The strike spread from West Virginia because it was on a railroad that was expanding through different states. And in Maryland, at least 10 workers were killed. So some of the things that the strikers wanted were simple things that we take for granted today: 8-hour workdays, a living wage, safe working conditions, right? So some of the things that came out of the labor movement, out of the rebellion that workers during the industrial age waged against their employers, some of the things actually brought about better working conditions. And then there were people like Samuel Gompers, right? Who was a Marxist. He was influenced by Karl Marx. That's widely known. And he was the first and the longest serving president of the American Federation of Labor, which is and was one of the strongest and longest lasting unions in the United States. So that is another root of labor unions: Marxism. It is to Samuel Gompers, the AFL-CIO writes on its website. It is to Gompers as much as to anyone else that the American labor movement owes its structure and characteristic strategies. Under his leadership, the AFL became the largest and most influential labor federation in the world. It grew from a marginal association of 50,000 in 1886 to an established organization of nearly 3 million in 1924 that had won a permanent place in American society. In a society renowned for its individualism and the power of its employer class, he forged a self-confident workers' organization dedicated to the principles of solidarity and mutual aid. It was a singular achievement, end quote. So, it was a standoff of the Marxists versus the capitalists, right? Which is kind of where we're at today. I mean, if you look at the struggle over the last year of the coronavirus, where you have the struggle of the parents in society to send their kids to schools, and you have the union class, the Marxist class of society, the education unions, the school unions, the teachers' unions, that is, saying no. And who's winning? Who's won on that struggle? Other things have opened. You can get whatever you want at Walmart. You can go to Target. You can go to Costco. You can go to your local marijuana shop. You can go to your local liquor store. You can go on the subway system, the metro, wherever you live. You can take public transportation. You can fly in an airplane. You can go to the mall. You can go to the movie theater. But in many states, in many areas of the country, where you can't go is to the public schools. The unions, the unions out there have been crying for months now, over a year now, that they really, really, really want to get the children back to school, but they can't do it until A, B, C, and D are done on behalf of the teachers, because the teachers need to be protected. The teachers at all costs need to be protected. They need to feel safe. And if the teachers don't feel safe, then the schools must stay closed. And another thing, even in areas where schools are opened, students are forced to wear face masks all day long, even on the playground, for crying out loud, even in after-school activities, if after-school activities are allowed in the school systems. Why? Because the teachers demand it. The teachers' unions demand it. The teachers' unions have held the nation in a sort of stranglehold for over a year now, bargaining and bartering with the politicians, waging a threatening war on parents without calling it that, all the while calling it concern for the teachers and concern for the children. It's a safety issue, they say. And yet, look around. The entire nation is pretty much opened, not to full normalcy, pre-pandemic normals, but at spots, even fitness centers are opened. You can go to your gym without a face mask. You can walk down the street in most areas now without having to worry about some Nazi-type nosy person coming screaming up in your face and demanding, "Where's your face mask?" like we saw months ago in videos from the streets of New York City. For the most part, America is getting back into business, at least in the parts where Democrats don't hold total control. But not the teachers in public school systems, which, coincidentally, that's the Democratic stronghold, right? The teachers' unions. So, Samuel Gompers might be proud of that show of strength. But really, what are unions doing these days that benefit the common citizen, that benefit society as a whole, that benefit anybody else but the union members? If you look at some of the strikes that have gone on between teachers' unions and state politicians, it's been utter chaos. I think back to Scott Walker's fight with the unions when he was governor. And those union members behaved in ways that were little more than 2-year-old temper tantrums. It was crazy when you look at the videos of how union members stormed the Capitol and set up camp inside the state Capitol, and politicians driven by unions, funded by unions, fled the state in some tantrum-like show of power that said, if you're not going to give us what we want, I'm going to flee the vote. It was crazy. And that's how teachers' unions are teaching teachers to behave, to get their way. The teachers' unions, in my view, have become little more than organizations for thuggery. They're crybaby thugs, petulant, whiny, power-hungry socialists / communists / Marxists. And if you look at the roots of unions in this nation, well, Samuel Gompers, Marxist. Need I say more? That tells you what you need to know. So the big question is, what do unions do for America at this particular point in time? Do they do any good? So let's broaden our minds and maybe have an open mind. And my next guest, David Osborne, he is the CEO of Americans for Fair Treatment. He's also an attorney and has litigated, gone up in court against some of these union types who have overreached, perhaps, on their powers to regulate the free market. And I think he has some interesting perspectives that can help decide, do unions, in fact, do anything for the greater good of America? Do they do anything for the American citizen, or are they all about gathering power for themselves, their few select elitist selves, and funding, don't forget, and then taking that funding and giving it to their few select elitist politicians who will in turn legislate in ways that favor the unions? It's a cycle. It's a power-hungry cycle. That's my view. But maybe David Osborne can convince me and you otherwise. David, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks so much, Cheryl.
So tell me a little bit your opinion on unions in America, where they stand today in terms of their usefulness for general society.
It depends a lot on the context. I work primarily with public sector employees, and unionization in the context of public sector employment is very different from private sector. Most private sector union employees, whether they're satisfied or not with their union, they saw that there was at least a time and a place for their union. However, with public sector employees, it's hard to go back to a time when public sector employees were ever really that helpful for our public sector workers. Most public sector workers tell me that what they don't like about their union has to do with the political influence that the union seems intent on building.
Mm-hmm.
Many public sector union officials are far more interested in building power and influence with the government than they are in properly representing public employees. In that sense, public sector unions, I think in the view of the folks that I work with, has outlived any usefulness that it had a long time ago.
So let's talk specifically about, say, teachers' unions, because they're the ones that have been in the limelight due to the coronavirus, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do teachers' unions do for, say, students?
Well, public sector unions do not exist. Teachers' unions do not exist to represent students,
right,
or even to further their education. And if you talk to an honest public sector union official, they would have to admit that their job is to represent the teachers, sometimes against the students, and sometimes against taxpayers who are funding the whole thing. With coronavirus and the way that the way that many teachers unions responded, what they saw is an opportunity to negotiate for things that they've wanted for a very long time. And in the process, I think many teachers actually felt like they were underserved by their union. I'll give you a couple of examples. Early on, especially, a lot of teachers unions saw an opportunity to bargain for a $15 minimum wage across the state.
Mm-hmm.
Has nothing to do with teachers. A lot of unions saw the opportunity to bargain for what they call racial equity, police reform, and those kinds of things. Again, nothing to do with education. Instead of, for instance, bargaining for a safe and sanitary working environment for teachers to return to the classroom, they ended up, I think, overplaying their hand. And in many cases, what happened is that teachers ended up going back to the classroom, sometimes when they didn't want it, and other teachers were prevented from going back to the classroom when they really, really wanted to come and work with their students face-to-face.
Well, how come unions seem to get such a free pass by many in America as being solid protections for the workforce? You hear even Joe Biden talk about the union, strengthening the unions, and it's a solid American principle to stand strong as a union member for the worker. How come they get such a free pass in today's world?
I think that's changing, and the coronavirus discussions, the news surrounding all that, and the teachers' unions threatening to strike over it, I think has put a big dent in public opinion. Now, I'll tell you from where we do most of our work in Pennsylvania and New York, I think public opinion goes way, way back. People remember their grandparents, talking about what the union did for them
Right.
back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And they assume that the same public sector union, or I'm sorry, the same unions that represented their grandparents back in the day is the same union that exists today, including public sector unions. It has dramatically changed, and what public sector unions are now is a far cry from what they were for people's grandparents back in early industrialization.
And where do you see that change originating from? Is there a certain year? Is there a certain?
Oh,
Go ahead.
absolutely, yeah. JFK did a deal with public sector unions in the late '60s, and the reason that unions were making such a push for public sector union representation at that time is that much of the private sector labor unions were getting rejected. I mean, we're seeing it now recently with Amazon and with many of the car manufacturers. Private sector unions are not always welcome. When workers feel like they've been treated pretty fairly by their private sector employer, unions don't have a place. They don't have a foothold. So given that, and given the strength of the economy in the 50s and 60s, the union officials started moving more toward the public sector. And today, that is largely where the money is coming from. JFK opened the door, but in the 70s, many state legislatures across the country further opened their own state workforces to unionization. And now in many states, especially up in the Northeast, unions have so dominated the public sector that it's hard to find a single employer. Connecticut, for example, has over 90% public sector unionization.
You're kidding. Wow.
They so dominate the public sector, including the legislature and the judiciary, that now they're bargaining for public sector union pensions. I mean, it's unreal what has happened, but you follow the money. It has everything to do with the money.
So if you're in a state like you just described in Connecticut, where 90% is unionized in the public sector, do you have an option as an individual when you join the public sector there? Are you automatically enrolled in the union and you don't have any opt-out?
That's a great question. The answer is a little bit complicated. So if you become a public sector worker in most unionized states, including Pennsylvania, New York, throughout the Northeast, California, in the Northwest, what you're going to do, what's likely going to happen to you is that on the first day of your employment with whether it's the state, a county, a municipality, is you're going to go through orientation, mandatory orientation. As part of that mandatory orientation with the state, the union has already bargained for unsupervised access to you during your first day of employment. They call it orientation, and you're going to sit at orientation with a union official up at the front of a conference room, who's going to put forms in front of you and ask you to sign. And it's going to be too close for comfort. They're going to ask for that signature immediately. They may or may not give you a copy of what you just signed. And from that day on, you may be on their payroll deduction and paying dues with every paycheck that you get. That's largely how it works. Now, do you have a choice? Yes. Not sure that that's always a real choice for many public sector employees in this context, but you do have a choice to say no. You are not required to pay dues to a union as a condition of your employment. Now, one problem still remains for folks whose sector, whose workplace has already been unionized. You have no choice but to be represented by that union in the context of collective bargaining. Whether or not you pay dues, that union is going to go to the bargaining table and it's going to speak with your employer on your behalf, and it's going to negotiate the terms and conditions of your employment. You have no choice. It's called exclusive representation. It's been challenged numerous times as an infringement of First Amendment rights. I think one day the U.S. Supreme Court is going to take another look at that. But for now, most public sector employees in these unionized workforces are going to be forcibly represented by a union and cannot go directly to their employer to change that.
You're kidding. So if I'm a worker and I want a raise, I can't go to my employer and make my case, whether I'm part of that union or not?
No, that is entirely up to your union. And of course, One of the major complaints I get from public sector employees is the union spends an inordinate amount of time representing people who don't want to do their jobs effectively.
Right.
And so as a result, union has a duty when they go to bargain on your behalf to represent those people just as much as you. It's going to be very hard for a high performer to get a raise, given that they're lumped in with all the rest of the folks who may not want to do their job.
Is this why you drive by work zones and you see 18 people standing around watching one person work on a road? Is it in part because of the unions?
I think the unions had a lot to do with that. You're talking mainly about private sector contractors with the state. Those arrangements are with the state are largely governed by prevailing wage laws, a very complicated set of laws that favor unions and unionized companies. So that when the company that has union representation comes in, the lowest performer gets the same kind of protection that the higher performer gets. That's how it works.
It's a good socialist system. So you litigate primarily, you said, in Pennsylvania and New York. What are some of the things that you've seen that have struck as most egregious overreaches of union control?
Our organization educates public employees. It's called Americans for Fair Treatment. Educates employees as to their First Amendment rights. And then we connect them with litigators who can represent them in court when it's necessary against their own public sector unions. I'll give you a great example of one of the folks that we've helped. A guy named John Cabler is an employee for the state liquor control system in Pennsylvania. And he, like many of the people that I was talking about earlier, had to go to a union orientation on his first day of hire. The union told him that he had to join the union as a condition of his employment. Now, I told you before, that's not true, but that's what union officials say in these protected environments. They actually sent him a letter that said that he would be taken off of the schedule if he refused to pay dues.
Wow.
So, of course, John, who did not support the union, did not want to pay money to the union. He still needed this job, and so he agreed to do what he would have not otherwise done and pay the union dues. The union lied to him, and when he tried to resign from the union, they pointed to the membership card that they made him sign. The membership card said that he would have to pay the union dues as regardless of his membership status with the union. That is, even if he were to resign his membership, which was restricted, he would still have to pay dues as a non-member.
Wow.
This kind of thing is egregious, but I'll tell you, that kind of language exists in union agreements throughout the country. And right now, there are many people who are trying to leave their unions but are confronted with stonewalling. These are the kind of people that we help and the kind of people that we want to hear from.
I think most people would be surprised that their friendly neighborhood union is doing this type of extortion of employees. It's funny. Well, it's a little bit ironic, I guess, that it's the left that cries about the exploitation of workers due to capitalists and so forth, and yet the unions that support the left in the political world are doing the same thing.
Yeah, well, the reality, these unions are multi-billion-dollar corporations that even though they're organized on a nonprofit basis, they are in the business of pulling money from local levels and sending them up to national officials who are engaged in politicking 100% of the time. It is a money-making machine.
And you know, it sounds almost like we don't have a free market, really, when you have heavy union presence in states. I know.
No, but exactly the opposite. It's a monopoly. So when unions gain exclusive representation of workers, what they're saying is that no other unions can compete to represent people in that workforce. No employees can step up and represent themselves. It is a monopoly, and of course, it ends up having the monopolistic effects of a cartel. The union ends up in position of negotiating for access to workers, and they have the power to, you use the word extortion. It's something like that when workers are most needed, like during the corona pandemic. The union has the ability to shut that valve off and make demands in exchange for access to employees.
I know our time's tight, but let me just wrap with another question or two. The flip side of this is that the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez types of the world would say that, what you describe are few and far between cases. And yes, there are problems such as you described that do occur, but by and large, unions are necessary, whether public or private representation, in order to represent employee rights, in order to represent worker rights, and to keep the employers from exploiting workers. Is that still true in this day and age? Do you see any sense in that argument at all?
Well, let's just talk about public sector unions for a minute. If that were the narrative, if that were the truth, then I could understand it a little bit better. But here's what actually happens. The public sector unions are so engaged in politics that what they end up doing is contributing money to, by and large, the Democratic Party, but to candidates who end up across the bargaining table from them. Remember, they're representing public sector workers. So they might represent public sector workers against the local school board, or against the city commission or the county commission. When they have done the work and spent the money to get the very people elected that are sitting across the bargaining table from them, the school board members, the city commissioners, what they end up doing is creating a vicious cycle in which they are negotiating not against the government, not against the politicians, but against the taxpayers.
Yep.
They together are working against taxpayers to spend their money in ways that behoove the union, and will end up coming back around to benefit the politicians.
Yep. I mean, you can see that cycle. It's as plain as the nose on your face. And as far as the private sector goes, talk about Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Jeff Bezos is a big far leftist, and yet he fights the unions of his own company, which has been on record with many employees coming forward and talking about egregious working conditions.
Mm-hmm. Well, this same kind of dynamic happens within unions themselves. Interestingly, unions are often unionized. So you've got some full-time employees who might work for the SEIU or AFSCME. These folks actually unionize against their employers. But when the SEIU or AFSCME or the NEA negotiates with this union, they take a hard-line stance, much like the evil capitalists that they accuse of hating unions. Many of these unions actually have, instead of pension systems, which they support for the employees that they represent, the unions actually have 401ks for their employees. Jeff is not unlike them. I mean, the way that these private sector employers work, they think that they've been gracious to their employees. When a union comes in, it's never enough, and so there ends up being conflict and agitation.
Okay, so if someone's listening right now and they have an issue with their union, can they contact you? Can they go to your website and ask for help?
Absolutely. I'm going to give you my email, david@afft.org. Our website is americansforfairtreatment.org.
So your website, your email again is david@AFFT. That stands for Americans for Fair Treatment, right?
Yep, .org.
All right. Well, David, that's some important information, and I'm betting there's at least a couple people who might reach out to you, given the state of the unions in the nation right now. So, David Osborne, CEO, Americans for Fair Treatment, I really appreciate your time and your information.
You're doing great work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the biggest problem with the unions is how they just ding the free market, right? They ding the ability, they hamper the ability of an employer to deal directly with an employee, and with an employee, the ability to deal directly with the employer. And you can make the case that in some instances this is necessary because there's strength in numbers, but, employees could gather together on their own and present an issue to an employer without having to go through a union, without having to pay dues to a union, without having to give up their own individual rights and control. control to a union. Something to think about. Thanks for listening. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.